Hello everyone, welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you're a returning viewer. My name is Laura and this is Culturing Nonsense, and today we are going to be talking about the closing statements and beginning of jury deliberation for the Elizabeth Holmes trial. So we're finally here. By the time you guys watch this, the jury will be full into the swing of deliberation. Closing statements were on Thursday and Friday last week, and the jury was kind of officially handed the case to start deliberations at like 4:40 p.m. I think, but they left at 5, so you could say they technically started on Friday, but I think this morning, Monday, 8:30 a.m. Pacific time is when they're really going to get into the nitty-gritty of deliberations. Sorry I'm a little late with this video. I had a very busy weekend and like a canker sore, so it really hurt to talk and I didn't want to record. But we're going to get into what was going on with the closing arguments from both the prosecution and the defense. So to start things off, Jeffrey Schenck, a lawyer for the prosecution, went back into the timeline when Theranos was kind of faced with a cash crunch and had a lot of trouble around 2009, 10, and 2013 when they really solicited a lot of these big investments. So he said that Elizabeth, kind of had the choice. She could watch Theranos slowly fade, or she could do something about it. He said that she chose to be dishonest and that her actions were not only callous but criminal. The government also offered a little bit of a recap of the 29 witnesses that they called over the course of about 3 months. So the jurors saw headshots of each of these witnesses, and there was also a little bit of talk of what parts of their testimony were specifically interesting to the prosecution's case. We'll get into a little bit of that later. The government also chose to draw a distinction between trade secrets and actual secrets and kind of attacked that argument that Elizabeth's defense had made before, that she was only doing things to protect trade secrets. The lawyer for the prosecution said that the jury shouldn't accept the argument that trade secrets gave her permission to make false statements. We revisited a clip from the Roger Parloff interview where Elizabeth told him that Theranos was only running tests on Theranos proprietary devices, which was not true. This was when they had those third-party analyzers that they retrofitted to be able to run their own tests. What I found particularly interesting about some of these closing arguments is that the prosecution kind of built the framework about what the jurors need to do in order to convict. So they talked about the legal arguments required for finding her guilty. So we can watch this case and think, oh, she did this, therefore she's guilty, but there are certain elements that have to be met. And this is when they start talking about that. So for part of this with wire fraud or intent to commit wire fraud, the prosecution showed several areas of control that Elizabeth had over the company. This included public relations and legal work, business development, decisions made around what lab regulators were told, messaging to doctors, binders given to investors, Department of Defense relationship, Theranos' website, financial projections, and pharmaceutical company partnerships. Part of the defense has been heavily deflecting Elizabeth's responsibility in all of these areas and trying to paint other people as being more responsible for what happened here. But at the end of the day, she was CEO and she had purview over all these things. Therefore, if anything went awry in any of these areas, she was the one who at the end of the day had the final say and was very instrumental in any intent to or commitment of wire fraud. Further, the government then provided a list of all of the misstatements that they allege Elizabeth Holmes to have made. So these are the specific things that they say are fraudulent and kind of go towards their case. This includes touting capabilities of the Theranos analyzer, including claiming it could do a full range of tests, using only fingerstick blood samples, and was more accurate, reliable, and faster than competitors, projecting financial stability, which also, as we know, was not the case, giving misleading demonstrations of its technology, often for VIPs, saying the Walgreens relationship was expanding, trumpeting a relationship with the Department of Defense, including that the devices were being used potentially on the battlefield or in medevac helicopters, hiding the use of third-party devices, saying Theranos had been validated by pharmaceutical companies, and using false statements in the media to woo investors. The prosecution then went through this list step by step and gave examples of each of these misstatements and even played audio clips of Elizabeth talking to investors. So the prosecution then used all of these misstatements to show how they could underscore this count of wire fraud. One of these elements is materiality, or showing how these alleged misstatements could have made an impact on the victim's decision-making. So basically what she told investors, how that swayed them to invest in the company and basically dupe them out of millions of dollars. For example, Lisa Peterson, the representative from the DeVos family, talked about the use of small blood samples and how that mattered to her. Texas money manager Alan Eisenman said the accuracy of the device was important. Chris Lucas said he was drawn in by Theranos' accuracy and use of automation. And Brian Grossman from hedge fund PMF Health Sciences LP mentioned the revenue Theranos claimed it had from the pharmaceutical companies. So these are all examples of how investors said they were specifically excited or interested by something that the government claims to be false. Following a short break during the day, the prosecution continued and said something else Elizabeth did was kind of let some of these false narratives spread. She didn't correct anything in the Fortune article that was incorrect and gave it to investors. There was a couple conversations she had with Sonny where, as we've talked about before, he tried to push back on some advertising and she didn't really budge. So this is another example of how she's not correcting these misleading statements that are out about her in the media. One other thing that was kind of frustrating that the defense has been doing that I'm happy the prosecution has pushed back on is the portrayal of Elizabeth as a naive 19-year-old. By the time that these charges came to light, she was, in her 30s. By the time she made any of these fraudulent decisions, she'd been running the company for a decade as a CEO. She is not a 19-year-old. The defense seems to be trying to freeze her in time and portray her as this young, naive girl, when in reality now she is a 37-year-old woman who ran a company for 15 years and a decade into that tenure made many fraudulent decisions that she was fully aware of. The prosecution also brought up the alleged abuse claims between Sonny and Elizabeth. Prosecutor Jeffrey Shank told jurors that if they returned a verdict of guilty, they're not saying we, the jury, do not believe her claims of abuse. Conversely, he said, if they return a not guilty verdict, it doesn't mean that they believe her abuse allegations. Your verdict doesn't validate her claims of abuse. Instead, he said that this case is about deciding if Ms. Holmes made false statements to investors and patients. He cautioned the jurors to view Ms. Holmes' testimony with skepticism, saying she has clear bias. The jury instructions that will be read to the jurors later on includes an instruction on how to weigh a witness's credibility into its deliberations. Again, I think this was a smart thing because he's saying, look, you can find her abuse claims sympathetic, but that's not the issue here. You really shouldn't be thinking about that in terms of your final deliberation. If that happened, it is very sad, but it does not change the fact that we're talking about, did she lie to investors to commit fraud and get money from them? Hey guys, I'm back. Sorry, the camera died, so if things look a little different, that's why. But it was a good natural stopping point. That was the end of the prosecution's closing argument, so now we get into the defense. The defense started off their closing statements by rebutting some arguments about Theranos' relationship with pharmaceutical companies, again talking about how they continued talks with Pfizer for a couple more years and just saying that we did have a relationship with these companies, the talks continued, and therefore it wasn't really fraudulent or misleading, saying that we were validated or had relationships with these companies. They talked about Dr. Shane Weber, who testified on behalf of Pfizer, and I don't want to say they discredited him, but they mentioned that he'd only worked with Theranos for a couple months, so he wasn't aware of the continued talks that Theranos had with Pfizer. So I believe the defense is trying to show, well, the witness that the government brought forth wasn't aware of these continued talks, and therefore anything that he said didn't have the full scope of the agreement between these two companies. The lawyers for the defense also showed a graphic that was kind of a visualization for the standard to convict, and I'm going to try to find something similar and put it up here. It was basically a staircase laying out the standards of proof that can be used in legal cases. So at the bottom it said no evidence, and that was followed by a couple levels, scintilla, reasonable suspicion, probable cause, preponderance, clear and convincing, reasonable doubt, and at each step a red box declared not guilty. And an explanation for this is basically that if a juror has any doubts about whether Elizabeth Holmes committed fraud, he or she couldn't vote to convict her. You pretty much have to be absolutely certain. So at the top of the staircase it reads beyond a reasonable doubt, minus the red box, indicating that that's the standard for finding guilt. So the prosecution actually has a pretty hard job, because when you say beyond a reasonable doubt, it means that you cannot have any lingering, what ifs in your mind. You have to be absolutely certain. You are not supposed to convict someone if you have any little niggling, I'm not sure feeling. The defense also laid out 5 bodies of evidence that they believe show that Elizabeth did not have any intent to commit fraud, and this included her interactions with the FDA, basically arguing that she was forthcoming when seeking regulatory approvals. The second one was feedback from research and development teams. Basically, that argument again that she was repeatedly told that the next generation 4.0 series was on track to handle 200 blood tests that the investors were told it could do. Prosecutors focused a lot on the 3.0 series, which is the one used to test patient samples that could only do a dozen different tests. So basically saying that she was confident that the next series could do better. The third one is feedback from outsiders, focusing on some of the positive feedback that Theranos got from the Mayo Clinic and pharmaceutical companies. Mr. Downey, the lawyer for the defense, also pointed to some glowing quotes in the Fortune cover story that's come up, which to me seems like a little bit of a misstep because it's been proven that many things in that article were false, so I wouldn't want to bring attention to it again, but I'm not a lawyer, so what do I know? The fourth thing was willingness to expose Theranos' technology to outside review by third parties. Again, reminding jurors that Walgreens asked Johns Hopkins University to review Theranos' technology, resulting in a review that the technology was novel and sound. If I remember correctly, though, there was something about that review that kind of makes this seem misleading. I'm not sure if they tested everything or had come to a firm conclusion. There was something about that review that made me think it was still a little bit preliminary. And the final thing here is reforms Theranos implemented in 2016. So after a bunch of problems were brought up by regulators, Ms. Holmes created advisory boards of top scientific and medical experts, hired a new lab director, and presented at an industry conference, among some other steps. So the lawyer is arguing that those actions showed a desire to get the company back on track once these issues came to her attention, essentially arguing that she wasn't aware of problems before, but once problems arose, she sprang into action to fix them. And then he asked the jury, are those the actions of someone who's engaging in a conspiracy to defraud people? The defense then further talked about how it wasn't a secret that Theranos was still using some venous straws instead of finger stick tests. Again, in my opinion, this is a little bit misleading because everything investors were told was that finger stick was the way to go. And also we have seen correspondence between people to try to make sure that certain VIPs got finger stick draws in a Walgreens setting, but we knew that they couldn't run certain tests, and there's a whole little conspiracy to make sure that certain people were getting finger stick tests, even though that wasn't the norm. Further talking about certain investors getting finger stick tests, the defense again is trying to blame investors for not doing their due diligence, saying that it is their own fault if they did not fully understand everything, didn't look into anything, etc. They further talked about Theranos' work with the military and tried to say that Elizabeth portrayed everything accurately. Yes, Theranos was involved with a couple studies with the Department of the Defense, and they did have a couple contracts that could have resulted in further work, but those eventually didn't pan out. So the defense's argument here is that while she was talking to investors, these contracts were still in the works. So she was talking about the potential they could have, the potential for Theranos to be on medevacs, etc., but that those things were not actively happening in the present. Again, it seems that many investors did not understand this, so the language that she used is pretty interesting. It walked a little bit of a fine line there, painting the picture that these things were happening, but if you actually look at what she specifically said and the tenses of the verbs, it is true that we don't have audio to point to where she specifically says this is happening right now. Then the defense tried to discredit the former lab director, Adam Rosendorf, saying that he signed off on all of the tests and also bringing up some problems that he has in his current job or the next job that he went to after Theranos, saying that a lot of the problems with the lab might have stemmed from him, not the lab itself, because he's a bad lab director. Finally, to close out their arguments, the defense essentially had a Elizabeth went down with the ship argument, saying that someone with ill intent, a rat, a sneaky person, a fake, a phony, whatever, they would have taken the money and run at the first opportunity, but she didn't do that. When the company collapsed, all of her shares were worthless, so she lost all her money because she believed in the company. She wasn't just trying to get rich. I think the fact that she didn't cash out at all is actually one good example of them trying to paint her as someone who truly believed in what Theranos could do. However, I think it is possible that she had a inflated sense of self-importance and her abilities, and maybe she believed that she could right the ship, continuing with this metaphor, and, get things back on track, and that eventually she would be back up to where she was before or even higher. Now, after the defense, the prosecution had one more chance to kind of rebut some things that the defense brought up in their closing statements. And this is again where we get the prosecution saying, listen, Elizabeth was a 37-year-old woman. She was not a 19-year-old naive college student. Something else I'm really happy about is that the government directly addressed this, blame investors strategy, saying that you cannot blame investors if fraud was committed. John Bostic said, the level of due diligence doesn't matter. A scheme to defraud is still a scheme to defraud, even if it would only ensnare someone who is less careful than they should be. This is also going to be in the jury instructions that the jurors received, essentially saying that an alleged victim's negligence is not a defense to wire fraud, which is something that I'd talked about before. It's essentially blaming the victim for saying you weren't intelligent enough to perceive the fact that I was tricking you. Mr. Bostic further said, in cases where you might feel that a given investor wasn't careful enough, know that it has nothing to do with your verdict. Again, drawing the lines of what is important here, what you shouldn't consider, what actual evidence needs to be considered for your verdict. Now, this is another piece of this too, kind of further explaining what the government has to prove for conviction. For that to happen, the jury has to find Ms. Holmes guilty of several elements beyond simply lying about Theranos' technology. First, the jury has to agree beyond a reasonable doubt that Ms. Holmes had the intention to defraud others. To find Ms. Holmes guilty of the conspiracy charges, the jury must decide that Ms. Holmes hatched a plan to commit wire fraud in partnership with another person. It would not be enough for the jury to think Ms. Holmes went along with whatever Sonny told her because they were romantic and business partners. The government also must persuade the jury that Ms. Holmes committed fraud for the purpose of depriving a person of money or property. This is from the jury instructions. The wire fraud charges against Ms. Holmes cover about $154.7 million in payments from investors to Theranos, more than $1.1 million in payments related to advertising to patients. Jurors must agree that the statements Ms. Holmes made as part of her alleged fraud scheme were material, that is, that they were significant enough that they influenced investors to write her a check and persuaded patients to swap a traditional lab service for Theranos. Several investors testified during the trial that Ms. Holmes was their primary or sole source of information about the company, and that her claims, including the Theranos devices were used by the military in the battlefield, which was false, convinced them to invest. Intent is another huge part of this. So not only do the jurors have to believe beyond a reasonable doubt that Elizabeth lied to these people, they have to believe that she did it with intent and that that intent was related to the material, essentially to take money or property from people. Again, the defense actually didn't bring up abuse claims at all in their closing statement. I think it was pretty telling that they left them out, and the prosecution did bring this up again by saying, this is not something that you should be taking into consideration. You can feel sorry for her, but it has nothing to do with your final verdict, which again is why, the defense couldn't really bring it up. It has nothing to do with their case, essentially. So after all of this, on Thursday and Friday, the jury were given the instructions, and it outlined a couple of the things that I just explained about what they actually have to believe if they are to convict Elizabeth Holmes. The jury is 8 men and 4 women, and they are currently in deliberations right now, so we shall see how long it takes. Just the instructions were 40 pages alone, which I'm sure will take them a lot of time to get through. I was on a jury once, and it was just for a very simple, medical malpractice case involving wisdom teeth. And we deliberated 4 hours on a Friday afternoon. We took it very seriously, and I'm sure these jurors are going to do the same thing. So even if they were to look over everything and come back with a guilty verdict pretty quickly, I think pretty quickly for a case like this is going to be at least a few days. So As I said, we'll see what happens, but I will be back with another video as soon as that verdict is in. And until then, like this video if you liked it, subscribe to the channel if you would like more coverage and future coverage of Sunny's trial as well. And I hope you all have a great day. I'll see you in my next video. Bye.